They rolled it out into the auction yard on a low farm dolly, and the whole crowd was laughing before the auctioneer found his first word. It was a pot-belly stove, a fat, squat thing of black cast iron, round-bellied as a hog and near as heavy, the kind that once stood in the corner of every country store and warmed 3 generations of cold men, except this one had been killed. Somebody, years back, had taken a torch to it and run a thick, ugly bead of weld clean around the loading door and the ash door both, sealing the firebox shut tight as a coffin, and then, for good measure, had soldered a crude iron plate over the draft, so the thing couldn't be opened and couldn't be lit and couldn't be anything at all but a 600-pound paperweight rusting in the October sun. Carl the auctioneer thumbed back his felt hat and called it the way a man calls a thing he's glad to be rid of, and the farmers on the hay bales chuckled into their collars, and somebody down the row hollered that it'd make a fine anchor if anybody around here owned a boat. Bidding opened at $5 and sat there like a stone. Then Walt Hennessy lifted one big scarred hand and said 10, and that was when the laughing got going in earnest, because everybody in Cooper's Mill knew Walt, and everybody knew Walt didn't have $10 to throw at a dead stove, not the way things had gone for him. He took it up slow and stubborn, 15, 25, 40, while Boyd Ransom, the junk hauler in the mustard canvas coat, leaned back grinning and called out, "What are you going to do with a welded stove, Walt? Heat your house by looking at it." The crowd loved that one. Walt just kept his hand up. He didn't argue, and he didn't grin back. He stood there in his patched gray chore coat with the thin cold light on his broad-lined face, and every time Carl glanced his way, he gave one short nod, the way you'd nod across a field to a man you knew. Carl's voice ran on quick and easy, and the number climbed 50, 60, 80, and the laughter took on that hard edge a crowd gets when it can't make sense of a man and decides it'd rather mock him than try. At $95, Boyd Ransom flapped both hands like he was shooing flies and said, "Let the old fool have his anchor." And the gavel cracked down, and they laughed Walt Hennessy clear across the lot to the cash box. What not one of them could see, not Boyd, not Carl, not a single soul on those hay bales in the thin October light, was that before the night was through, that dead welded stove would lift Walt clean out of the hole he'd been sinking in for 2 long years. But that was hours off yet, for now there was only the laughter, and a worn-down man counting out bills he could not spare, and a sealed black stove nobody wanted going home with the one man in the county stubborn enough to find out why somebody had welded it shut. Let me tell you how that came to be. Walt Hennessy was 58 years old at fall, a widower, a blacksmith and welder by trade, and the kind of man a town quits looking at without ever once deciding to. His shop sat at the low end of the county road, a long tin-roofed shed with a forge gone half cold and a hand-painted board over the door that read Hennessy Iron and Weld. Taped inside the office window, where any man walking past could read it, was a notice from the bank, 4 months behind now, and the 5th coming due. Inside the shed hung the tools of a life, the tongs in their row by size, the hardy and the swages, the leather apron cracked and shining with old use, the welding hood with its dark scratched glass, and the long acetylene rig he'd kept clean and ready 40 years even now that the work had thinned to almost nothing. There'd been a time a smith was a man a county leaned on. Time was a broken plow point or a cracked wagon iron or a busted gate hinge meant a trip out to Walt Hennessy, and you'd stand in the orange light and watch him bend hot iron to his will like the metal owed him a debt. But the world had gone to bolt together steel and the implement dealer in town and parts that came in a box from the city, and the young men welded their own gates now, badly. And the calls had dried up to a trickle and then to nearly nothing. On the office wall, in a plain wood frame, hung a photograph of a round-faced woman with a wide, easy smile. Ada, she'd been 2 years gone. The illness took her slow and took the savings down with her, dollar by dollar, and after they laid her to rest, Walt found the silence of the shop had a different weight than the quiet he'd worked in all his life. He'd stand at the cold forge of an evening with a piece of scrap in his hands, not because anybody needed it shaped, but because his hands had to be doing something that wasn't grieving. He'd come up in the trade as a boy of 17, set to a hard old smith over in the next county who used to cuff him and tell him that iron never lies, that fire will always show you what a thing is truly made of, the sound and the soft spots and the hidden flaw, if a man is patient enough to read it. Walt had carried that 41 years. He'd forged hinges that still swung true on barns built before he was born. He'd welded a cracked church bell yoke so the bell could ring again for a town that had near given up on it. He'd cut open a fire-warped strongbox for a flood-ruined family so they could reach the deed inside. The work had been honest and hot and good, and there was a plain dignity in being the man you sent for when the iron had beaten everybody else. He had married Ada the year he opened the shop, and for 30-odd years the two of them had run it side by side, her keeping the books in a neat slanted hand and bringing him coffee out to the forge on the cold mornings and standing in the doorway watching the sparks fly with a smile like she'd never tire of the sight of it. They'd never been given children, and so the shop had been their child instead, and the customers their family, and the work the thing that gave the days their shape and their meaning. Now the forge sat cold most days, and when the phone rang on the office wall it was the bank, never a customer. The town had a word for men like Walt by then, kind enough not to say it where he'd hear. Done, past it, a relic, same as the trade. And maybe that is why, when Carl rolled that welded-shut pot-belly stove out into the yard and the whole county laughed, Walt Hennessy saw something none of the rest of them could. He didn't see scrap. He saw weld. 40 years of laying down a bead and 40 years of cutting one back open had taught Walt one thing the laughing men would never know. Nobody welds a stove shut for nothing. You don't take a torch to a perfectly good firebox, run an ugly bead around both doors, solder a plate over the draft, and then keep the heavy thing instead of selling it for scrap, unless there is a reason. A man seals a thing that hard because he means to hide it, and he hides it inside a dead, ugly stove nobody would look at twice, precisely, because nobody would look at it twice. The crowd saw an anchor. Walt saw a strong box somebody had been clever enough to disguise as junk. He'd seen it once before, years back, a farmer over the county line who'd welded his savings into the hollow leg of a hayrake and lost the secret to a stroke before he could tell a soul, and it had been Walt they finally sent for when the family ran out of other ideas. People hid things in iron because iron lasts, because iron keeps, because iron does not talk. And the better a man knew iron, the better he could read where another man had asked it to hold a secret. The laughing farmers on the hay bales had spent their whole lives buying things. Walt had spent his learning what things were hiding, and there is a wide gulf between the two. And there was something else, too, something he didn't say out loud and barely let himself feel. That a man who could cut open what nobody else could open might, for one more night, be worth something to somebody. So he bid. A neighbor with a flatbed owed Walt a turn for a gate he'd hung and never charged for, and between the two of them and a borrowed plank ramp and a deal of grunting, they wrestled the stove up, and Walt hauled it home alone down the county road through the long blue dusk. The whole way he could feel the town watching from behind its glass, and he knew well enough what they were saying, because in a place like Cooper's Mill, the talk outruns the man every time. There goes Walt Hennessy, spent his last $95 on a stove that won't even open. Old fool's finally gone soft in the head. He passed the feed store and the chapel and the diner where two men in the lit window tracked him with their eyes, and somewhere along that road a small cold doubt climbed up into his chest and made itself at home. What if they were right? What if he cut the thing open and found it packed with nothing but old ash and mouse nest, and he'd thrown the mortgage money after a hunch? He thought about Ada, about what she'd have said, and he could almost hear her, not scolding, never that, just that dry, warm lift she got. Well, Walt, you went and bought it. Best fire up that torch and see what you bought. He got it down off the flatbed in the gravel behind his shop in the dark. By lantern and by lever and by the slow, bull-headed patience, that's about all a tired man has left some nights. And he rolled it in through the wide shed door and stood a moment with both hands flat on its cold round belly, breathing hard. Then he straightened, and he took off his cap and set it on the bench beside Ada's photograph, and he said, more to the shed than to anyone, "All right, let's have a look at you." It was gone 9 o'clock when Walt Hennessy lit his forge back to life and pulled on his cracked leather apron, and what came in the next 4 hours is the part of this I most want you to see, because it is the part the laughing crowd never got. He did not reach straight for the torch. A man who's read iron 40 years knows you study a thing before you cut it. He took up the lantern and went over every inch of that black stove, slow and close, running his scarred fingers along the ugly weld bead at the loading door, the second bead at the ash door. The crude soldered plate clapped over the draft, and the more he looked, the surer he got. This was no factory seal and no accident of rust. Somebody had worked hard to shut this stove. Somebody who knew enough about iron to make it stick and not quite enough to make it pretty, and they'd done it in a hurry, the way a man works when he is afraid. Walt tapped the round belly with a knuckle, up high and then low, and he closed his eyes and listened the way his old master taught him, and where the upper belly rang hollow and bright, the lower belly came back dull and packed and dead. There was something in it. Down low, behind the welded firebox door, the iron was holding its breath. Now he was careful. A man cutting blind into a sealed box has to think about what waits on the other side of the steel, and Walt had cut into enough mystery in his life to respect it. He set the fire brick down to catch what fell, he wet a sack and laid it ready, and he lit the cutting torch and trimmed the flame down small and clean, a thin blue needle of fire, because he did not mean to gouge whatever lay inside. He meant to peel that door like the lid off a tin, and no deeper. The first touch of flame on the old weld threw a fan of orange sparks across the dark shed, and the bead began to run and glow, and Walt walked the torch along it slow and even, the way he'd walked 1,000 beads, his broad-lined face lit hard from below, the dark glass of the hood down over his eyes. The shed went away, the town went away, the laughter went away, and there was nothing in the whole black night but Walt Hennessy, and the bright crawling line of fire, and the dull ringing secret packed down in the belly of $95 of iron. The old weld fought him. Whoever laid it had laid it deep, and twice Walt had to back the torch off and let the metal cool so he could read where the original door ended and the bead began, because the last thing his hands would let him do was cut careless into something a frightened man had hidden with such care. His shoulders burned, and the sweat ran down under the hood, and the heat beat back off the iron into his face. But his hand stayed sure on the torch, because his hands did not know how to quit a piece of iron once they'd started in on it, never had. He thought once halfway through that he'd misread the whole thing, that the dead ring was just packed rust and he was burning the night for nothing, and the small cold doubt came creeping back up his chest. He set the torch down and pushed the hood up and stood breathing in the spark smell and looked over at Ada's photograph in the lantern light, and then he pulled the hood back down and bent again to the work, slower, surer, and cut on. At last the bead parted with a small, tired sigh of metal, and the welded door dropped a hair on its old hinge, free for the first time in years. Walt killed the torch. The shed went very quiet, just the tick of cooling iron and his own hard breathing. He let it cool a long while. A man does not reach a bare hand into a stove he's just been cutting, and he splashed it with the wet sack until the steam quit rising, and only then did he work his fingers into the gap and pull the heavy firebox door open on its complaining hinge. The lantern light reached down into the belly. For a moment Walt just looked, the way you look at the first hard frost on the grass, not quite ready to lay a hand to it. There was no ash. That was the first thing. No ash, no clinker, no sign this firebox had ever once held a fire, which told him the welding had come young before the stove was ever lit, and told him whoever did it had meant this from the start. A man does not seal a working stove. He buys a new one, or he finds one already past its use, and he makes it over into a thing it was never meant to be, a hollow black secret that any thief or any heir would walk straight past, because who in the wide world would ever think to look for a fortune inside a stove too ugly and too dead to burn? Packed down in the dry, dark belly, wrapped careful in waxed canvas gone stiff and brown with age, was a bundle. Walt lifted it out slow with both scarred hands, the way you lift something that might be precious or might be nothing, and he set it on the bench in the lantern light and peeled the stiff canvas back. Money, real money, banded in paper wrappers, gone soft and tan. The bills inside old style and large brown seal notes and silver certificates from the 20s and the 30s, the kind a man laid by when he'd stopped trusting banks, and the years that followed had proved him right to. Walt's hand shook a little as he lifted the first banded bundle, and he made himself set it down and count slow, the way he counted everything. And the count kept on climbing past anything he'd let himself hope. He counted it through twice, because a man who's been poor long enough doesn't believe good news the first time it knocks. When the second count matched the first, he sat very still on the stool and let the number be true, and he found his rough hand had come up to cover his mouth the way it had at Ada's bedside. And he wasn't rightly sure if what rose up in him was relief or something nearer to grief for all the long months he'd spent reckoning himself worth nothing at all. Under the banded cash, folded flat in the waxed canvas, was a leather wallet cracked at the seam, and inside it a thick sheaf of railroad bonds and a fan of war savings bonds, Series E, issued in the war years and never once cashed. paper that had been quietly drawing its interest in the dark of that dead stove the better part of 20 years, and was worth, Walt reckoned, a good deal more now than the face printed across it. And down at the very bottom of the bundle, wrapped on its own in a square of flour sacking, was a small thing, not money at all. A pocket watch, gold, worn smooth, and a folded packet of letters tied with a bit of brown string, and tucked behind the string a photograph, sepia-faded, of a lean old man with a heavy mustache and tired, kind eyes, standing proud in a shopkeeper's vest in the doorway of a country store. Walt knew that face. The whole county had known it, once. Garrett Cole had run Cole's store at the mill crossroads for 50 years, behind the same oiled counter, carrying half the township on credit through 2 hard winters, keeping a barrel of penny candy for the children and a chair by the stove for any old man with nowhere warmer to sit. Walt had bought nails there as a young husband and warmed his hands at that very counter on more than one January morning, and he remembered Garrett Cole as a man who'd never once made a customer feel small for being short a dime, who'd write the amount in a ledger with a nod and tell you to settle it when the crop came in. And then the Highway Commission ran the new road 2 miles south and took the traffic with it, and the store died slow the way Walt's forge was dying, and somewhere in the dying the county decided Garrett Cole was finished too. A relic, past his time, a stubborn old man rattling around an empty store that ought to have shut its doors years back. He died alone in the rooms above that store, and the bank had taken it, and his goods had gone to just the same kind of auction that laughed at Walt, and that was the last most folks ever thought of him. Walt sat in the lantern light and worked the brown string loose and read the letters, and as he read, the whole shape of the thing came clear to him. They were letters Garrett Cole had written and never sent, to a granddaughter named Lila, the one soul of his blood left to him after a hard falling out with his own son had set into years of stony silence. The son had passed. The girl had been small when the break came, and a grown woman by the time Garrett understood that his pride had cost him every person he had ever loved. The letters were a long, halting sorry, written out across years, each one telling Lila about the store, about her grandmother, about the money he was laying by, so that one day, when he found the nerve to send for her, she'd have something solid to stand a life on. He had welded it all up inside a dead stove and hidden the stove in plain sight among his junk and never once found the nerve. He had died before he could set it right, and the county had hauled his last secret out into a gravel lot and laughed at it, and the only man who could open it was a widower they'd written clean off. Same as they'd written off Garrett Cole. Walt set the last letter down soft on the bench. He looked a long while at the faded photograph, at the tired, kind eyes over the heavy mustache, and he said, low, into the quiet shed, "All right, Garrett, I'll see it through for you." It took Walt Hennessy 3 days to run down Lula Cole, and he found her in a rented half of a clapboard house on the wrong end of a town 2 counties over, working the early shift at a laundry and behind on rent of her own, which Walt, of all men alive, understood to the bone. She came to the door in a faded green house dress with a worn cardigan pulled over it, her dark hair pinned up, her gray eyes tired and guarded and just barely hopeful. The way the eyes get on people who've learned the hard way not to expect much and can't quite teach themselves to stop. Walt took off his cap. He told her who he was and what he'd bought and what he'd cut out of the belly of it, and he watched her not believe a word, and then he set her grandfather's letters into her two hands, and he watched the not believing come apart. She read the first one standing right there in the doorway and had to put her hand to the frame to keep her feet. Walt waited, cap in his hands, the way he'd waited on the cooling iron, because some things will not be hurried, and a man who works metal learns that before he learns anything. She told him, low and unsteady between the reading, that she'd grown up believing her grandfather hadn't wanted her, that the long silence between the families had always been laid at his door, and she'd carried that the way a child carries a thing too heavy to understand, carried it straight on into being a grown woman who flinched at a stranger's kindness. And here in her own two hands was the proof that the old man had thought of her every single year of that silence, had been saving and writing and meaning to make it right, and had only run clean out of time and nerve before he ever ran out of love. That is a hard and holy thing to be handed on a doorstep by a stranger in a patched gray coat, and she wept, and Walt let her. And the cold afternoon went long and gold around the two of them. When she could speak again, he told her about the money and the bonds, and he told her the law and the plain custom of it straight, that he'd bought the stove fair and square in front of the whole county, and that by every right under heaven, the whole of what was inside it was his. And then he told her what he meant to do instead. He kept the finder's share, a fair portion, the portion that wiped out 4 months of back payments and the 5th coming due, that cleared the note on the shop and bought fresh acetylene and new stock, and kept the lights burning at Hennessy Iron and Weld for as long as Walt Hennessy had hands left to swing a hammer. He had earned that. Cutting careful in the dark while the county slept off its laughing, and Garrett Cole, who had carried half the township on credit and never shamed a soul for it, would have been the first to say a working man ought to be paid for honest work done well. But the bonds and the bulk of the cash and the gold watch and every last one of those letters he laid into the hands of Leila Cole, because that is where Garrett had always meant them to go. And a man who'd spent his whole life opening up what was sealed understood better than most that some things are sealed shut only so they can one day be opened for somebody else. Word of it got back to Cooper's Mill the way word always does, faster than the man who carries it. They heard that the welded-shut stove nobody would touch had been packed full of a small fortune, and that Walt Hennessy had cut it open clean in a single night, and that he'd handed the most of it on to a girl he'd never met who had nothing to her name. Carl the auctioneer told it around the diner with his quick, easy mouth, and for once he told it straight through. And Boyd Ransom, the junk hauler in the mustard coat who'd asked was Walt fixing to heat his house by looking at the thing, Boyd Ransom didn't have a great deal to say about any of it. He drove past Hennessy Iron and Weld one afternoon that week and let off the gas and looked a long moment through the wide door at Walt bent over his anvil, working the way he always had, and then he drove on, and the grin was nowhere on him. The whole town that had laughed went quiet, and the quiet held, because there is nothing a place can find to say when it learns that a man it threw out was worth more than the whole of what it bid on. I've told you this the way it came to me, and I've turned it over a good many times since, and here is the part I keep coming back around to. The worth of a thing and the worth of a man are alike in one hard way. It doesn't always show on the surface, and it doesn't always show on time, and a whole crowd can stand around laughing at a thing of real value and never once guess what's been sealed up inside it. Garrett Cole was worth more than his dying store, and he proved it in the dark, alone, year after year. with a kindness the town never knew to thank him for. Walt Hennessy was worth more than his cold forge and his gray hairs and his run-out trade, and it took one welded stove and one long night to prove it to a county that had quit looking at him. And it took the right hands, patient hands, hands that knew how to read iron in the dark and how to cut without gouging, to find the worth that not one other soul could see. That is all any of us is truly hoping for, I think, to be opened gentle by somebody who believes there is something good still sealed up inside. If a story like this one stayed with you, go on and subscribe to Worth Unseen, and I'll see you at the next auction.